Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Sanctuary. I'm your host, Professor C, and we're going to be doing some more A&P today. Specifically, we're going to check out some muscle metabolism and metabolic pathways. So, let's have fun. All right, this topic of muscle metabolism is quite complicated. So we want to do the basics of muscle metabolism. I plan in the future to do a full-blown deep dive into metabolism, but right now let's just limit it to muscle physiology and try to keep it as simple as we can, okay? So here's a guy, he's taken off 1, 2, 3 gunfires and the race is on, and he starts sprinting as fast as he can. Well, we've learned from previous lectures that in order to make your muscles contract and do work, you need ATP. And it is the only direct source that's used to contract the muscles. In fact, we use ATP to cock the myosin heads, and then we also use ATP to uncock the myosin heads. And, as a side note, as you build muscle and you break off those myosin heads, you need ATP to reconstruct those heads as well. So ATP is the fuel that is used to contract muscles. And if you take off sprinting like this guy does, you're going to, and so is he, going to run out of ATP that's stored in your cells in about 5 seconds. That's all you've got. So if you want to continue sprinting beyond, say, 4 or 5 seconds, you need to regenerate this ATP very, very rapidly within your muscle cells. So there are 3 basic mechanisms, and I say basic, but each one you can go deeper and deeper into if you wish. The simplest one is probably ATP generation through creatine phosphate. There's an aerobic style of respiration, which will, of course, require oxygen to be taken in. And then there's some ancient anaerobic pathways, sometimes referred to as just glycolysis or glycolytic pathways. So in aerobic metabolism, this is where most of the ATP will be generated when you're doing, say, light to moderate exercise, as it says here in these notes. The fuel sources for aerobic metabolism, in order of preference, and I know this is arguable, but it goes glycogen, then blood glucose, then pyruvic acid or pyruvate, fatty acids, and then finally proteins if necessary. You don't want to start tearing proteins down in a cell unless you've run out of other fuel sources. Of course, this is going to require oxygen, being that it is aerobic metabolism, and it will require, in our cells at least, mitochondria, so we can perform things like the Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid or the TCA cycle. The electron transport chain is going to happen in the membrane of the mitochondria, and oxidative phosphorylation. Again, I plan to do a deeper dive into each of these in much further lectures from now. When I hear anaerobic metabolism, I often immediately think of bacteria, because a lot of bacteria, that they don't do aerobic metabolism like we do. They only have one style of it. They're not very big, right? They don't grow very rapidly sometimes, so they don't need a whole lot of ATP to go sprinting in a race. But we do still have in our human cells these ancient pathways, and we use them when oxygen is, the delivery of it is either diminished in some way or it's impaired in some way. Now, we still will do glycolysis. We still will make a little bit of ATP, but we certainly will not make the huge amounts that we can make during aerobic respiration. So remember, 95% of ATP is created aerobically, and the other small portion will be done anaerobically. At some point, we're going to make a waste product called lactic acid, and this will start to accumulate in places we don't want it to accumulate, let's say. Okay, for this image, I want to deal with the major pathways, as it says up top here, the major metabolic pathways. Notice on the left there, we have a reddish colored blood supply, is what that's supposed to be. And my white box is labeled muscle fiber down at the bottom. And I have a flash of ATP up in the top right corner, because that ultimately will be our goal here through these pathways, is to generate ATP so we can contract our muscles. Well, not only contract, but also relax them as well. Okay, the first pathway that we're going to see is creatine phosphate. And it's often talked about first because it's the immediate source of ATP in cells. And I'm just going to put creatine phos so we see it like that. and it's readily abundant inside of a cell. There is also readily abundant adenosine diphosphate, ADP. So we have these two guys hanging out together inside of a cell in the presence of an enzyme, and I'll just put a C for creatine, and I'll spell it out, kinase. In the presence of an enzyme called creatine kinase, we can get creatine to remove itself from the phosphate. The phosphate will hook up with the ADP and will create ATP. And that's really the end of the story there. It's very quite simple. And you will do this within seconds. But you'll also deplete your reserves of creatine phosphate and ADP in seconds as well. So we have to have some backup pathways, and those are the ones I'm going to show you now. If I can draw your attention down to the bottom left now, I have liver glycogen drawn here. The Y is kind of cut off, but this is supposed to say glycogen, and that is a chain of carbohydrate, right, stored in the liver. I can, if I need to, pull that out and turn it into glucose very rapidly. Now, this is called glycogenolysis, so I'm going to write that here. Glycogen, right? It's got the word glycogen, and then O, and then lysis, referring to break. So we're going to break glycogen. So if I can take some liver-stored glycogen, break it through glycogenolysis, I can receive some glucose straight into the bloodstream. Now I can get that to go into the muscle, and it's at this point we have a choice whether we are going to rest, if that muscle is going to rest, or if it's going to contract, right? So I'll just put here, contract. And those are our two options. At rest, we can take that glucose and convert it back into glycogen, but of course we won't ship it back out to the liver. We'll store it here in the muscles, and this is going to be called muscle glycogen. Now, that's not too interesting to us because we didn't do anything, right? We didn't generate any ATP by storing that. So let's look at what would happen if we wanted to go the contract pathway. Well, if we wanted to contract, we would continue our processes until we encounter something known as glycolysis, something that happens in the cytoplasm of all living organisms. So glycolysis, not glycogenolysis. And it tells what we're going to do. Glyco meaning sugar, lysis meaning break. So we're going to break some sugar here. And when we do the breakdown of sugar, two things will happen. The first thing that will happen is we're going to make a little bit of ATP. And this will happen in about 1 to 5 seconds of us needing that power. Okay. Now, another product we get out of this is something called pyruvate. So I'm going to spell that out real quick. Pyruvate. All right, and once we get to this pyruvate, we have some options. Are we oxygen rich or oxygen poor? So let's do this first. Let's say we're oxygen poor, and I'll just put O2, but I'll cross it out, and then I'll remind ourselves that that's called an anaerobic pathway. And of course, these will fuel those fast twitch glycolytic fibers that we talk about. And what happens is we will convert that pyruvate to something called lactate. And that will accumulate sometimes in the muscle cells, sometimes in the bloodstream. And we will get, as a bonus, a little bit more ATP from that, but it's almost inconsequential compared to some of the other ways we got ATP. So this lactate can be converted back into glucose by a process known as gluconeogenesis, which of course if you break the word down means sugar, gluco. Neo is new, and genesis is to create. So to create a new sugar from something that wasn't a sugar. Okay, so what if we have another option here? What if we do have oxygen? What can we do? And of course, where will that oxygen come from? It will come from the blood. So here comes some oxygen from the blood, and this will be the aerobic mechanism. And now what can we do? Well, from this process, we can create something called acetyl-CoA, and I'll just write it as A-CoA. And from here, we can enter a process known as oxidative phosphorylation. And of course, that will be part of the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. This will be what we usually refer to as cellular respiration, aerobic cellular respiration. And this will give you some ATP, but it will take a little bit longer because it's got to go through, all those different steps. Got to go through Krebs cycle, electron transport, and so forth. But you will create a lot of ATP if you can go that pathway. Now, as a waste, if you want to think of it that way, CO2 would be certainly thought to be a waste product that is formed during that oxidative phosphorylation. And water is also removed from that system. Okay, but what about if we don't have, a lot of glucose? What if we've run low of creatine, we've run low of blood glucose, we've run low of glycogen? What do we do now? Well, we're going to start hitting the fats. So I would say, let's just put the word fats up here. I'm talking body fat like in adipose tissue, where you've previously stored reserves. You will pull these fats out, and you will pull them into the blood as fatty acids. Remember, fats are just glycerol heads with some fatty acids attached to them. And then through a process of beta oxidation, I'll write it like this. Beta oxidation, you can turn those fatty acids, at least the glycerol part, into acetyl-CoA. And that can enter the oxidative phosphorylation in the Krebs cycle, electron transport, and create a lot of ATP. Well, what if you run out of fats? Well, your last resort is going to take amino acids, or parts of proteins that you've broken down inside that cell. And we don't want to do this. Remember, the actin and the myosin that are allowing us to contract and relax the muscle are made of protein. We don't want to break those down unless we have to. But we can, through a process called deamination, return into the oxidative phosphorylation and generate ATP as a very, very, very last resort. Okay, I think that's enough of that. Okay, just wanted to define and introduce this concept of oxygen debt. Whenever you do some kind of exercise, at some point you're going to be done, right? You're going to enter some recovery phase, and just think about yourself running up the stairs or something, and you'll be kind of breathing hard, right? Well, what you're doing there is you're trying to get out of what's called oxygen debt. Without getting into the details of the chart here, during this recovery phase, our cells need to replenish things that we've spent during our exercise. So we need to replenish oxygen, our glycogen levels, and ATP. And all of this together is usually put under one umbrella referred to as oxygen debt. Muscle fatigue here at the very end of this talk is the inability to contract. It's not just that you're tired after helping your buddy move some furniture in his new apartment. It's that you literally can't get up. And you've seen some of the marathon runners simply collapse onto the ground, and they cannot stand up, and they have to physically crawl across the finish line. That's why. This has something to do with the ionic imbalances that are responsible for allowing us to do our excitation-contraction coupling. And we also have accumulation of lactic acid from all the many, many number of cells that have switched to the anaerobic pathways to keep on trucking. But rarely do we have a total lack of ATP. And that makes sense, because if we were to lose all of our ATP, would probably lose ATP in our cardiac cells, and our heart would stop, would also be at a loss of ATP in our brain tissue, and would just basically black out, and we wouldn't be in a very good state. So most of it has to do with other things rather than reduction of complete ATP stores. Okay, hope you enjoyed that talk. Thanks for watching it to the end if you did. Check out some other videos in the series if you want to learn more about muscle action. And I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.